And now we cross over to our Usiang for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The Beijing Olympics are in full swing after Chinese President Xi Jinping declared the 2022 Games open on Friday. Held just 6 months after the delayed Tokyo 2020 Olympics, the Games are taking place amid an intense lockdown in China, where a more subdued opening ceremony was staged. The sporting event is also being held as the United States and other countries have pursued a diplomatic boycott of the Games over Beijing's human rights violations of its Uyghur population. We discussed the very unique dynamics of the Beijing Games as China takes centre stage for the second time in the Olympic history. For this, we're joined by Susan Brownell, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who has been researching sports and the Olympics in China for about 4 decades. We're also joined by Richey, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. And well, let's begin with you, Professor Brownell. Now, well, you're an Olympic expert, really, and Olympic diplomacy expert as well. And well, I'm just curious to know how you're finding the Beijing Games so far, and also how it compares to the previous Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, which you also researched.
Well, it's not unusual that political controversy precedes every Games, and of course there were political tensions actually preceding the Pyeongchang Games, and they centered around North Korea. Those Games actually ended up with on a happy note. I mean, I met people on the streets in Gangneung that said maybe this, after all, will be the Peace Olympics, because North Korea ended up attending. There was a joint women's ice hockey team. The 2 North and South Korean teams marched into the stadium together, and progress was made in U.S.-North Korea relations, which eventually led to a summit in the summer. So those Games ended up with a feel-good sentiment when the Games were over. This time we have tensions between the US and China, and because of the diplomatic boycott by the Biden administration, I think it's less likely that we will end the Games with summits or other progress being made towards solving thorny political issues. So I'm less optimistic that these Games will end on the feel-good note that the Pyeongchang Games ended on.
I see. Well, as we all know, there's a diplomatic boycott going on staged by the United States, the UK, Australia, and a number of other Western countries, as well as countries like India. And well, Professor Brownell, does the diplomatic boycott of the Games directly affect the Games itself?
Well, I think we could go back to other boycotts which were politically ineffective, and so I think it's likely that this effort will be politically ineffective also. But really, what happens in the end is that the global audience is much more interested in the sports than the politics, and really whether politicians are present at the Games, even whether heads of state are present, is not something that gets a lot of attention or is remembered afterwards. I mean, leading up to the Beijing 2008 Games, there was a fairly large number of heads of state who said that they would not attend those opening ceremonies as a form of protest against China's treatment of Tibetans. And these days, nobody seems to remember that actually there was that diplomatic action then. So I kind of think that once the Games start, the sports take over, and what the public remembers afterwards is the fantastic sports performances, the athletes, and the wonderful scenery.
And now, Professor Richey, to bring you into the conversation. Now, a lot has changed in the world since Beijing held its first Olympics in 2008. Of course, back then, it was more about China really coming out to the world and showing how it's been playing as a part of the international community. But of course, now with these boycotts and these diplomatic frictions with other countries that Beijing is facing, the situation is vastly different. And well, how has China's standing really changed since its 2008 Games?
So first of all, you're right that 2008 was intended to be China's coming out party, as you put it, and of course now there's no need for that. China is, along with the U.S., one of the two colossuses, striding along the world and determining quite a bit of what happens in international politics. So that's not really necessary. Instead, I think what we're seeing is that the Chinese Communist Party is looking at these games instead in part as a way to underline its competence, its wisdom in governance, to underline the effectiveness of its model of governing, or if you want to use a stronger word, of controlling society. It wants to underline the differences between the CCP system and approach to governance and those of Western countries in particular. And that, of course, is taking place in the background of COVID, where many of the Western countries, have not been very effective at dealing with COVID from an epidemiological perspective. Whereas China's embraced a near COVID zero policy, or pretty close to it, which has implicated some extremely draconian lockdowns. So I think that this attempt to try to underline party effectiveness is an important difference compared to 2008. I think the other thing is, China, I think definitely is more mixed now in terms of its global reception, the global opinion. In 2008, it was still possible, I think, for many people to see the sort of warm and fuzzy side of China, whereas now I think what we've seen over the last 15 years, of course, is that China can be extremely draconian, and I'll just say that the CCP, not necessarily the people of China. And I think that it's going to be a bit of a harder row for the CCP to try to win some positive PR out of these Olympics compared to 2008.
So we're seeing a much more assertive China. And well, Professor Brownell, how do you see the significance of the 2022 Games compared to the 2008 Olympics? What do you think the Chinese government's goals were in hosting these 2022 Games?
Well, as Professor Richey observed, in 2008, the meaning of the Games was clear. It was China's coming out party on the world stage as an equal with the other strong nations, and leaders had held that view of hosting the first Olympic Games for 100 years. So everybody was on board with the meaning of that Games. I think even when China was bidding in 2015, the meaning of this Games was less clear. They probably didn't even expect to win the bid, because normally it takes at least 2 tries before a city can win a bid. And so I'm not sure that they ever had a really clear message that they wanted to communicate. And then in the midst of the COVID pandemic, that changed everything anyway. So, mostly China has arrived, and maybe that's the message now. We are here, accept it. They are not backing down in terms of the criticism that they are enduring. And I think that's part of the message that they will communicate, which is that we are strong, we stand on our fundamental principles, and we will not compromise on them. So, but there are a lot of things going on underneath the surface that I do think are encouraging. And one thing I would just like to point out is that for the first time, China actually has a number of athletes at these games who were born and raised in other countries and who switched citizenship to represent China. And this was not even allowed before, because China is so xenophobic, and they never really encouraged citizenship switching. So at the same time that we see political tensions at quite a high at the level of politicians and rhetoric, I think there are some things happening at these games that could be a cause for optimism.
And Professor Richey, well, countries like Australia and those in the European Union, they took a clear stand against human rights abuses by China. And while South Korea hasn't, though, South Korean President Moon decided not to boycott the Beijing Olympics. Well, this also comes despite most South Koreans being rather wary of the Chinese government, according to recent polls by the Asan Institute here in Korea. And of course, there was also a lot of controversy building since last year as Chinese press and also Chinese officials, they were making some cultural claims over South Korea's cultural content, its traditional dress such as Hanbok, and of course this also sparked a bit of outrage over the last few days as well as Chinese athletes dressed in Hanbok, the Korean attire. They were wearing that at the Beijing Olympics. But well, amid all this controversy, why hasn't the issue been so clear-cut for the South Korean president? Why wasn't it taking a clear stance? I mean, what were really the calculations between President Moon Jae-in's his position on China?
Well, I don't have privy to what runs through President Moon's mind, but if I had to conjecture, I would say it's a pretty clear, realist calculation, that statesmen have to make all the time. Namely, in this particular case, Moon knows South Korea is heavily dependent on trade with China, both on the export and on the import side. China is South Korea's #1 export partner. It's responsible for critical component imports coming into Korea, which are very important for the economy here. South Korea, of course, also has memory of the way that China responded to South Korea's installation of a terminal high-altitude area defense battery here, which the U.S. requested, and resulted in it after its installation in extreme economic coercion by China against South Korea. Tens of billions of dollars in lost revenue through economic punishment, illegal economic punishment, I should know, by the way. By China against South Korea. I think a part of it, a very tiny part, but probably somewhere there in Moon's calculation, is wanting to keep Beijing on board with respect to policy towards Pyongyang. Although at the moment, I think that's probably likely to be the case anyway. So I don't think he would lose very much in this regard. And then I think, probably, Moon wants to leave the South Korea-China relationship on a decent footing when his successor takes office after the upcoming election in March. I think that's probably part of it as well. Compared to the other countries you mentioned, such as Australia or the EU, I guess I would simply say, look, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your neighbors in international politics. And, Australia was already antagonized by China and has been for the last few years, so it actually didn't cost it very much to go along with this diplomatic boycott. The EU, for its part, part of its soft power, part of its international reputation involves at least giving the perception of being very supportive of the human rights agenda. So it's extremely costly for the EU not to appear to support that. So the EU member states who joined, I think, in part, have to keep that in mind as well.
And well, President Moon didn't end up going to the Beijing Olympics after all, but there were in fact very few world leaders who ended up turning up at the Beijing Olympics due to COVID as well, of course. But Professor Brownell, now, China's foreign ministry said that Washington had clearly violated the Olympic spirit and, quote, will pay a price for its erroneous actions. However, it's not really specified what this price might be. What do you think is meant by this?
Well, I actually don't think there will be a price if we can look back at 2008 and see what happened then, for example. I mean, as I mentioned, there were heads of state then who protested, not only by not attending the opening ceremony, but also by inviting the Dalai Lama to their countries and receiving him as an honored guest ahead of time, which always provokes Chinese anger. And if you look at the context, the already existing relations between China and those countries that chose to take those actions, there were already tensions anyway, and this was just reflecting an already existing pattern. And so I think what happened in 2008, and probably what will happen now, is that there won't be any specific retribution from China for this one action, but rather that these relations will continue as they were, which is to say there were tensions and ongoing negotiations in any case. I mean, if any of these countries are hosting a mega event in the near future, it could be that China will not send any government officials or the head of state will not attend. But there aren't that many mega events on the level of the Olympics which get that amount of media scrutiny. So China won't have that many opportunities. I mean, maybe the FIFA World Cup upcoming in Qatar, but Qatar is not one of the problem countries.
And Professor Brownell, do you think Beijing will change its behaviour and perhaps improve its human rights situations as Western nations boycott the Games and continue their diplomatic pressure, probably beyond the Olympics as well?
Well, I think history shows that Olympic boycotts have been ineffective. We can think back to the Cold War boycotts in 1980 and 1984 when there was the mutual tit-for-tat boycott by the US and the Soviet Union. And it's generally agreed that they were completely ineffective and only harmed the athletes. And that is a phrase that you hear even today. And that's the reason that since the end of the Cold War, there actually haven't been any national boycotts when nations did not send any athletes. And that's why Biden chose something else, this so-called diplomatic boycott, which is actually a new diplomatic tool that has never been tried before. So, I mean, we can see what happens, but history doesn't give us encouragement that it will produce any real effects on the ground in China. And if you look at the pressure that China was under in 2008 and how it responded afterwards, the main response was in the area of foreign communications, because China decided that it didn't have a big enough presence and voice in the international media. And so it invested in infrastructure and in extending the international reach of its own media so that it could get its vision out there in the world to counteract the attacks in the Western media. So, you know, after this Olympic Games, they'll probably be assessing whether that effort was successful. And if anything changes, it may be that they will continue to work in this area of communications and perhaps won't actually do anything to change the on-the-ground situations that attracted the criticism in the first place.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to close the interview. That was Susan Brownell, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Mason Richey, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.